marker to Jesse at Graceland. His body has never been moved. If you want to visit the body of Elvis's older identical twin brother, it's here in Tupelo, Mississippi.
The world was told that Elvis Presley's twin brother died at birth, a stillborn, but recent revelation proves otherwise. For 90 years, a secret has been locked away in hospital records, hidden from the world. The truth about that January night in 1935 is finally coming to light, and it changes everything. Could the king of rock and roll have shared his throne with someone else? What really happened in that Tupelo hospital? Join us as we uncover the shocking truth that's been buried for nearly a century. The discovery. The filing cabinet sat in the corner of the Tupelo County Archive building, its metal surface covered in decades of dust and neglect. The label on the drawer read, "Incomplete Records 1935," in faded ink that had turned brown with age. For years, nobody had bothered to look inside, assuming whatever documents remained there were simply unfinished paperwork from the Great Depression era. Nothing worth disturbing after all this time. Margaret Yates had worked in that archive for 34 years, organizing birth certificates and death records and marriage licenses with the same careful attention she brought to every task. She knew these files better than anyone, had memorized the names and dates of families who had lived and died in this small Mississippi county going back more than a century. On this particular afternoon, she pulled open that neglected drawer as part of a routine digitization project, expecting to find nothing more interesting than incomplete farm records or unsigned property transfers. The birth certificate lay near the bottom of the stack, its paper yellowed and brittle at the edges. Margaret lifted it carefully, squinting at the handwritten name that had been recorded in black ink nearly 90 years earlier. Jesse Presley. Her breath caught in her throat. Everyone in Tupelo knew that name, knew the tragic story of Elvis Presley's twin brother, who had died at birth on January 8, 1935, stillborn and buried in an unmarked grave while his surviving brother went on to become the king of rock and roll. But this document told a different story entirely. The certificate clearly listed Jesse Presley as born alive at 4 o'clock in the morning, weighing 4 pounds and 11 ounces. The space where cause of death should have been marked remained blank. Instead, in the section reserved for disposition, someone had written 2 words that changed everything. Released to family. Not stillborn, not deceased, released to family. Margaret's hands trembled as she realized what she was holding, this single piece of paper that contradicted nearly 9 decades of accepted history, that suggested Elvis Presley's twin brother had not died that cold January morning, but had somehow survived and been given to another family. The birth. January 8, 1935. The temperature dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit that night in Tupelo, Mississippi, a rare and brutal freeze that turned the ground hard as concrete and made the thin wooden walls of the 2-room shotgun shack on Old Saltillo Road feel like they offered no protection at all. Inside, Glattis Presley lay on a narrow bed, her body racked with contractions that had been coming in waves for 35 hours straight. Vernon Elvis Presley stood outside in the frozen darkness, only 18 years old, and absolutely terrified. His wife was 22. They had been married barely 2 years, and between them, they had exactly $3.47 to their name. The shack they rented had no electricity, no running water, no heat beyond a single wood-burning stove that barely kept the frost from forming on the windows. Vernon had tried to find work for months, but the Great Depression had crushed the South harder than anywhere else, leaving young men like him with nothing but desperation and empty pockets. Mrs. Hunt, the midwife who had delivered half the babies in East Tupelo for $1 per birth, worked by the light of kerosene lamps as Glattis screamed and pushed through that endless night. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the first baby finally came. He emerged silent and still, his tiny body blue and unmoving in the cold air. Mrs. Hunt wrapped him quickly in a torn bedsheet and placed him in a cardboard box near the stove, shaking her head slowly as she turned back to Glattis, who was still in labor with a second twin. Jesse Presley never cried, never took a breath that anyone heard, and Mrs. Hunt pronounced him stillborn within minutes of his birth. Vernon, standing just outside the door, felt something break inside his chest when he heard the midwife's quiet words of sorrow. 35 minutes later, everything changed. The second baby came fighting and screaming into the world, his lungs filling with air as he announced his arrival, with a cry so loud it echoed through the frozen morning. Elvis Aaron Presley weighed 5 pounds and 2 ounces, pink and alive and furious. Vernon collapsed to his knees in the dirt outside the shack when he heard that sound, tears streaming down his face as grief and relief twisted together in a way that made it hard to breathe. But then something unusual happened. Dr. William Robert Hunt arrived at 5:30 in the morning, driving up to the Presley shack in the pre-dawn darkness, even though families in East Tupelo almost never could afford a real physician's services, and even though Vernon and Glattis had no way to pay him for coming at all. The Mantel family connection. 7 miles away from the Presley shack, in a slightly better neighborhood of East Tupelo, lived a couple named William and Vera Mantel. They had been married for 11 years, both in their mid-30s, and their small house stood neat and well-maintained on a street where most families struggled, but at least had steady work. William worked for the railroad, one of the few reliable jobs left during the Depression, and his weekly paycheck meant they owned their home outright and never went hungry the way so many others did. But money could not buy them the one thing they wanted most. For a decade, Vera had tried to carry a baby to term, enduring 5 miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally devastated. The last pregnancy nearly killed her, the bleeding so severe that the doctor told them trying again would be suicide. By 1935, they had accepted their fate as a childless couple, attending First Assembly of God Church every Sunday and watching other families grow while their own remained frozen at 2. Then, on January 10th, 1935, exactly 2 days after the Presley twins were born, William and Vera Mantel stood before their church congregation and announced that God had blessed them with a son. They named him James Aaron Mantel. The baby lay wrapped in a clean white blanket in Vera's arms, his tiny face peaceful and sleeping, as the congregation gathered around to offer congratulations and prayers. Several women in the church exchanged confused glances. Vera had not appeared pregnant in recent months. There had been no baby shower, no gradual preparation of a nursery, no excited announcements about expecting a child, just a sudden infant appearing in their lives with no warning. When asked about it, Vera explained quietly that the baby had come early, premature, and fragile, which was why they had kept the pregnancy secret, not wanting to jinx it after so many losses. Nobody questioned her story. In rural Mississippi in 1935, you did not pry into family matters, especially when it came to respectable church-going people like the Mantels. If they said the baby was theirs, then the baby was theirs. But the birth certificate filed for James Aaron Mantel revealed some troubling coincidences. The document listed Dr. William Robert Hunt as the attending physician, the exact same doctor who had appeared at the Presley shack on the morning of the twins' birth. The certificate was filed not in Tupelo County but in Lee County, the adjacent jurisdiction. The birth date recorded was January 8, 1935, the same day Elvis and Jesse were born, and the weight listed was 4 pounds and 11 ounces, precisely matching the weight recorded on the newly discovered certificate for Jesse Presley. Glattis's lifelong grief. Glattis Presley never recovered from the birth of her twins, not physically and certainly not emotionally. In the years that followed that frozen January morning, she developed habits that everyone around her found strange, but nobody dared to question. Every evening when she set the dinner table, in whatever small house or apartment they were living in, she placed an extra plate beside Elvis's spot. She would stare at that empty chair for long moments before serving the food, her face carrying an expression that went beyond simple grief into something darker and more complicated. When she went shopping for Elvis, she bought 2 of everything. 2 shirts in the same size, 2 toys, 2 pieces of cake from the bakery. One for Elvis, and one that she would set aside and later give away or hide in a drawer. Friends who visited the Presley home noticed photographs of a baby boy displayed prominently, but when they asked who it was, Glattis would simply say, "My son," without elaborating, leaving them uncertain whether she meant Elvis or the twin who had died. She told Elvis stories about how Jesse would have been the quiet one, the thoughtful one, while Elvis was wild and loud. She created an entire personality for a child who had supposedly never taken a breath, building a ghost so real that Elvis felt like he was living in Jesse's shadow, even though Jesse had never cast one. But there was something about Glattis's grief that did not quite fit the pattern of a mother mourning a stillborn child. Her sadness felt more like guilt than sorrow, more like the anguish of separation than the pain of death. She drank heavily as the years went on. Her her health deteriorating rapidly through her 40s. People who knew her said she seemed haunted by something she could not speak about, carrying a secret that ate away at her from the inside. In 1956, a photographer captured Glattis standing outside the newly purchased Graceland mansion, holding a framed photograph. When researchers examined the image decades later and zoomed in on the frame in her hands, they could see two baby boys lying side by side, identical in every way. One was labeled Elvis, the other had no name written beneath it, and Glattis's finger was touching the second baby's face with an expression that looked less like mourning and more like longing, as if she were reaching for something that was still alive somewhere beyond her grasp. Yabwam Mantel's search. James Aaron Mantel grew up in a loving home with parents who doted on him and provided everything a child could need during the difficult Depression years. William taught him how to work with his hands, how to be honest and dependable, values that came from his railroad job, where punctuality and reliability meant everything. Vera baked him cookies every Sunday, sewed his clothes by hand, and made sure he never doubted for a single moment that he was wanted and cherished. He had no reason to question his origins. The Mantels were his parents, the only parents he had ever known, and the quiet life they built together in East Tupelo felt solid and real. James grew up, got a job with the railroad just like his father, married a good woman, and had 3 children of his own. His life unfolded in the ordinary way that most lives do, marked by small joys and manageable struggles, nothing dramatic or extraordinary. But in 1973, as Vera Mantel lay dying in a hospital bed at the age of 71, she reached for her son's hand and whispered words that would haunt him for the next 5 decades. Her voice was weak, barely audible above the beeping of the machines, but James leaned close and heard every syllable clearly. "You were a gift," she said, her eyes filling with tears. William had already passed away 4 years earlier in 1969, so there was nobody left to ask, nobody who could tell James what his mother had meant by those cryptic final words. For 51 years, he searched for answers. He found his birth certificate, the one filed in Lee County listing January 8, 1935, as his birth date. He tracked down records of Dr. William Robert Hunt, the physician who had signed the document. He discovered the address where a family named Presley had lived in 1935, just 7 miles from the Mantel home. But none of it came together into a coherent story until 2019, when James was 84 years old, and his granddaughter showed him a documentary about Elvis Presley. The moment Elvis's face appeared on the television screen, James felt the room spin around him. He was staring at his own reflection, not similar or kind of close, but identical in every way that mattered. The same nose, the same cheekbones, the same slightly crooked smile that he had seen in the mirror every single morning of his life. Elvis's hidden knowledge. Elvis Presley talked about his twin brother Jesse constantly throughout his life, referring to him in interviews and private conversations, with a grief that never seemed to fade. He told friends and family members that he felt incomplete, like half of himself had been ripped away before he even took his first breath. When he spoke about his childhood or his career, he often used the word we instead of I, saying things like, "We were born in Tupelo," or "We started singing in church," as if Jesse were still there beside him, experiencing everything together. Priscilla Presley, who married Elvis in 1967 and lived with him through some of his most difficult years, later told interviewers that Jesse's presence haunted their marriage. Elvis kept photographs of a baby boy in his bedroom at Graceland, images that Priscilla had never seen in any other family collections. When she asked him who the baby was, Elvis would say it was him, but something about his answer never felt quite right. The baby in those photographs wore different clothes than Elvis wore in his other infant pictures. The blankets were different. The setting looked unfamiliar. But the most chilling piece of evidence came from a letter discovered in Elvis's safe deposit box in 2003, 6 years after Priscilla's lawyers were sorting through his estate documents. The letter was written in Elvis's own handwriting, dated August 14, 1976, just 1 year before his death. The words were shaky and uneven, written by a man whose physical and mental health was rapidly deteriorating. "I saw him today," the letter read. Or, "I think I did. Mama said I was crazy, but I know what I saw. Same face, same walk. He didn't see me. I didn't say nothing. What would I even say? Hey, you're supposed to be dead. I can't do this no more. I can't keep looking. If he's alive and don't know, maybe that's a mercy. Maybe it's better he don't carry this weight too. At the time, doctors and family members dismissed the letter as the paranoid ramblings of a man deep in prescription medication dependency. But if James Aaron Mantel truly was Jesse Presley, then this letter was not a delusion at all, but a confession. The DNA evidence. In December of 2024, James Aaron Mantel walked into a genetic genealogy testing center in Memphis, Tennessee, carrying with him 89 years of questions and a desperate need for answers before time ran out. The lab technician swabbed the inside of his cheek, sealed the sample in a sterile container, and told him the results would take approximately 6 to 8 weeks to process. James had done this before, taken DNA tests through commercial ancestry websites, hoping to find some connection to the Presley family line. But those results had been inconclusive, showing distant relatives and vague connections that could have meant anything or nothing. This time was different. This lab specialized in forensic genealogy, the kind of deep genetic analysis used to solve cold cases and identify unknown remains. They would compare his DNA not just to public databases, but to verified samples from known Presley family descendants, cross-referencing multiple genetic markers to establish or rule out a sibling relationship with absolute certainty. The wait felt endless. James spent those weeks organizing all the evidence he had accumulated over the years, the birth certificates and photographs, and church records and timelines that he had been piecing together like a puzzle with half the pieces missing. He contacted a lawyer to discuss what might happen if the results came back positive, what legal and ethical obligations he would have to come forward publicly. The results arrived 72 hours before the press got wind of the story. The genetic genealogist who analyzed James's sample called him personally, her voice careful and measured as she explained what they had found. The DNA showed a direct sibling-level match to verified Presley family descendants, not a distant cousin connection or a coincidental overlap, but the kind of genetic markers that only appear between people who share both biological parents. The probability of this match occurring by random chance was less than 1 in several billion. She repeated that number twice to make sure James understood what it meant. Meanwhile, the 1956 photograph of Glattis holding the framed image of 2 babies underwent its own forensic examination. A collector in Germany who had purchased it at auction in 2018 agreed to have it analyzed by imaging specialists who could determine if the photograph had been altered or manipulated in any way. They examined the paper stock, the developing chemicals, the grain patterns in the film, every microscopic detail that might reveal tampering or forgery. The results came back unambiguous. The photograph was completely authentic, taken in 1956 with period-correct film and development techniques, showing no signs of digital manipulation or physical doctoring whatsoever. Glattis Presley had indeed been holding a picture of 2 living babies 21 years after Jesse's supposed death, her finger touching the unlabeled child's face with an expression that forensic psychologists described as longing rather than grief, reaching rather than mourning. The impossible choice. Understanding why Vernon and Glattis Presley might have given away one of their twins requires understanding just how desperate their situation was in January of 1935. The Great Depression had hit rural Mississippi harder than almost anywhere else in America, turning already poor families into people who genuinely did not know where their next meal would come from. Vernon was 18 years old and unemployed, unable to find steady work despite walking miles every day looking for construction jobs or farm labor or anything that would pay even a few cents. He had tried everything, begged for opportunities, stood in lines with dozens of other desperate men, competing for a single day's work. The shack they rented on Old Saltillo Road had no electricity, no running water, and no insulation against the brutal cold that winter. They heated the 2 tiny rooms with a single wood-burning stove that required constant feeding, with wood they could barely afford to buy. Glattis was malnourished and weak from the difficult pregnancy, her body already pushed to its limits before she endured 35 hours of labor that nearly killed her. The $3.47 they had between them would not have been enough to feed 1 baby adequately, let alone 2 premature infants who needed constant care and warmth. When Mrs. Hunt wrapped that first tiny blue baby in a torn bedsheet and placed him in a cardboard box, Vernon and Glattis faced a decision that no parent should ever have to make. If both twins survived, both might starve. The math was brutal and simple. They could not produce enough milk, could not afford formula, could not keep two fragile newborns alive through a Mississippi winter in a house with no heat beyond a single stove. One baby might make it, two babies would not. The Mantels, just 7 miles away, represented a solution that must have felt like both salvation and damnation. William had steady income from his railroad job, they owned their home, they were desperate for a child after years of devastating miscarriages, and they attended the same church where everyone knew everyone's business and troubles. Dr. William Robert Hunt arriving at 5:30 that morning was not a coincidence or an act of charity. He came because arrangements had already been made, agreements reached in the desperate hours of that long labor when it became clear that 2 babies were coming, and the Presley family had no way to care for them both. Depression-era adoptions in the rural South were not legal proceedings with paperwork and courts and agencies. They were private arrangements between families, often orchestrated by a trusted doctor or midwife, often involving a small amount of money that meant survival for one family and a longed-for child for another. $20 or $30 change hands in transactions like these, enough to pay rent for a month or buy food to keep a family from starving. Vernon and Glattis kept Elvis because he was stronger, because his cry was louder, because he seemed more likely to survive the harsh conditions they lived in. They gave Jesse to the Mantels because he was smaller and weaker, because he needed more care than they could provide, and because maybe, just maybe, they told themselves it was an act of mercy rather than desperation. Legal and family implications. The moment the DNA results became public knowledge, the Presley estate's legal team went into crisis mode. Graceland Enterprises, which managed Elvis's intellectual property and generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually from licensing deals and tourism, suddenly faced the possibility of an additional heir with legitimate biological claims to the estate. Priscilla Presley, who had remained largely out of the public eye in recent years, was contacted by reporters within hours of the story breaking. She declined to give interviews but released a carefully worded statement through her publicist. The Presley family is aware of the recent claims and is cooperating with genetic genealogists to determine their validity. Out of respect for all parties involved, we will not be making further statements until the analysis is complete. Elvis loved his brother Jesse deeply, and if there is any truth to these allegations, it will be treated with the dignity and care that both men deserve. But sources close to Priscilla said she was absolutely devastated by the news. She had never known about the 1976 letter, never suspected that Elvis might have seen his brother alive and chosen to walk away. The image of Elvis carrying that secret through his final year, the weight of it compounding all the other guilt and pain he was already drowning in, broke something in her that had never fully healed even decades after his death. Lisa Marie Presley, before her own death in 2023, had reportedly told close friends that her father was haunted by Jesse in ways that went beyond normal grief. She described finding him late at night, talking to photographs, keeping images of a baby boy hidden in drawers at Graceland, referring to himself as incomplete and broken. She believed her father had carried a secret about Jesse that he could never bring himself to share, something that went deeper than simply mourning a stillborn twin. The legal implications of James Aaron Mantel being confirmed as Jesse Garon Presley were staggering. As the biological twin brother of Elvis, he would technically be an heir to the Presley estate, entitled to a portion of the intellectual property rights, royalties, and assets currently managed by Graceland Enterprises and the Presley Family Trust. The estate generates millions of dollars annually from music royalties, licensing deals, and Graceland tours, and the sudden appearance of a legitimate heir could throw decades of legal arrangements into chaos. But James had made his position clear through his attorney. He was 89 years old. He did not need money. He did not want fame or a piece of the Presley fortune. He wanted only one thing: the truth about who he was and where he came from. The answer to a question that had haunted him since his mother's dying words in 1973. The tragedy. Elvis Presley spent 42 years of his life mourning someone who might never have died at all. He carried the weight of Jesse's supposed death from his first conscious memories until his last breath on August 16, 1977. Every success he achieved, every stage he conquered, every record he broke felt incomplete because he believed his twin brother should have been there beside him, experiencing it all. He told Priscilla repeatedly that he felt like he was living for two people, carrying the burden of a life that should have been shared, but instead belonged only to him. In interviews throughout his career, Elvis would sometimes slip and refer to himself as we instead of I, saying things like, "We were born in Tupelo," or "We loved gospel music," as if Jesse were still present, still part of him in some fundamental way. Priscilla later described it as eerie, this constant awareness of an absent twin who seemed to hover at the edges of Elvis's consciousness no matter where he went or what he achieved. Every success felt hollow to him because Jesse was not there to share it. But if Jesse was not dead, if he was living just miles away, and then later hundreds of miles away, as James Aaron Mantel, working on the railroad and raising a family and growing old in peaceful obscurity, then Elvis spent 42 years mourning someone who was alive. He carried guilt that did not need to be carried, grief that was based on a lie, and an emptiness that could have been filled if only someone had told him the truth. In June of 1977, just 2 months before his death, Elvis performed what would become one of his final concerts. He sat at the piano to sing Unchained Melody, his voice strained and his body visibly failing, the years of prescription medications and poor health showing in every labored breath. Halfway through the song, he stopped playing and looked out at the audience with an expression of profound sadness. "I always felt like I was looking for somebody my whole life," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and I never found him." The audience assumed he was talking about a lost love, about Priscilla, about the loneliness that fame had brought him. But what if he was talking about Jesse? What if in those final months of his life, Elvis had finally understood the truth that his mother had carried to her grave, that somewhere out there his twin brother was alive and living a completely different life, never knowing who he really was or where he came from,